Okay, so welcome to Brown Bag History today. We're going to be talking about the Scandinavian community. And as we start, we acknowledge that the land around Revelstoke and on the Columbia River and its tributaries is traditional Snayaks territory. We acknowledge the ties of the Secwepemc, the Okanagan Nation Alliance, and the Tanaha to this land. We acknowledge our use and inhabitation of this land, sacred to these four nations. We respectfully honor their traditions and culture. So the Scandinavian countries are Denmark, Sweden, and Norway. The broader term Nordic countries also includes Iceland, Finland, and the Faroe Islands. But we're going to be talking mostly about settlers that came to Revelstoke from the traditional Scandinavian countries of Denmark, Sweden, and Norway. Just a note that we had today was originally scheduled for the Italian community, and that was rescheduled. So we switched the talks. That one will be in 2 weeks. So this was one of an early settler who came to Revelstoke, originally born in Denmark, and this is his wedding photo. He married Addie Hamilton, who had come to Revelstoke with her family in the 1890s. They were married in Revelstoke on June 4th, 1895. And her sleeves are quite epic. I really like her sleeves. Yeah, the waistline. Yeah, there's definitely a corset involved in there too. Could have been. Yeah. Yeah. So anyway, he came to he was following, as a lot of the early settlers that came here in the 1880s. He followed railway construction across the country, and by 1885 he was in Beavermouth working on railway construction, and he left there during 1885 and walked into Farwell. So it would have been just like a bit of a pack trail through Rogers Pass at that time. And he was working between Beavermouth and Revelstoke on CPR construction. He was one of the first men to settle in the Farwell area that owned a team of horses, and he was hauling wood. He lived for a while at the Oriental Hotel, which I'll talk about in a minute. In 1886, he was working with two other men, John Dunn and Ike Stevens. They were packing supplies up the Big Bend. He did that for 3 years, so he was one of the early packers into the Bend. After 1886, he helped with the construction of a building at Downey Creek and also worked on the first wooden bridge at Farwell in 1885. So that would have been probably the toll bridge that went across. So when he was packing supplies, he was going, it was about 70 miles north of French Creek. There was a note in the newspaper on December 1st, 1894, saying that John L. Nielsen, and he was known as both Nielsen and Nelson. The name was later anglicized to Nelson, but the original spelling was Nielsen. Said that he'd started on Tuesday morning on his first trip to the Big Bend with the mail. So he was one of the first contracted mail deliverers into the Big Bend area. Said that there were about 50 people to be accommodated by the service who made a small payment for it, but the post office was also contributing $20 a month for 5 months. Said it is an arduous and dangerous trip to be taken alone in the depths of winter, and Mr. Nielsen should be adequately paid for it. There was mention also of his dog train, and he was one of the first people to have a dog train in the area. We don't know for sure that this was one of his dogs, but it was identified in our collection as being a Big Bend pack train dog, and I'm never going to miss an opportunity to show a dog in my presentations. It said that this was January of 1895. Said during the early part of the week, Front Street seemed to be alive with dog teams and their trainers. The man who inaugurated this class of locomotion here is John P. Nielsen, who carries the mail between Revelstoke and the Big Bend. He had a team of 4 dogs hitched to a sleigh, which he drives tandem. A nice set of black leather harness has been made for each dog by a local shoemaker. The breaking in of Nielsen's team afforded a good deal of amusement and created a great deal of emulation, and several dogs dragging small sleighs with living freight were to be seen on the streets. Some of the canines were obstreperous and would bolt in the wrong direction, while others would lie down in the snow. Revelstoke dogs are quite unused to being trammeled by fetters of any kind, but now that the dog team has been inaugurated, we may expect to see more of it. Nielsen's team may become perfectly docile in harness, and he will probably start for Big Bend tomorrow with a sleigh load of about 150 pounds of supplies and mail matter. And the Nelsons had a fairly big family, and John Nelson died in 1945 at the age of 41, and his wife died in 1947 at the age of 72. When they were married, she was 72. Did I? It says he died in 1945 at the age of 81. What did I say? 41. Okay. Thank you for keeping me honest. Another person I wanted to talk about was Pete Peterson, and I think he was a bit of a character. He was also born in Denmark in about 1850 and came to Revelstoke in the 1880s. He had settled on Front Street, and he built what was known as Peterson's Hall on Front Street. It opened in, I believe it was on the town side of Front Street. It opened in November of 1892 with a dance. It was described as being 62 by 25 feet with a stage. It had a white pine floor laid on top of inch planking. And there's a quote from the newspaper when they had the inaugural dance. It said the white pine talked about the planking on the floor, said giving it a solid dead sound equal to the famous oaken floors of ancient baronial mansions, and just as polished and slippery, which several of our gallants discovered to their cost when they abruptly stopped in the midst of a polka or schottische and found their heels where their head ought to be, while a sympathizing laugh gurgled around the room. He moved his hall to Columbia Park in 1902, and the house is currently where his great niece, Greta Spearbrecher, and her husband live in Columbia Park. The newspaper of Kootenay Mail of October 21st, 1905, said a village settlement where great improvements are seen. A man who believes in tree planting is P. Peterson of Revelstoke. On his 18-acre block in the village settlement, he has already planted out 1,800 fruit, shelter, and ornamental trees. A novel idea that he had was to plant creepers and ornamental trees around a big stump 21 feet in circumference, with a summer house built at the top of it for the delectation of his visitors. It will make one of the prettiest nooks in the neighborhood of the city. I don't think that ever happened, but it was a pretty neat idea. So he settled there for quite a while. We have another photograph that I didn't include here, where it shows the edge of his property, and there's writing on the bottom of the photograph with him complaining that somebody had cut down his trees and used them. I'm not sure what the reason was. I guess there was somebody had pasture land there and they wanted the trees out of the way. So he actually complained in the photograph about no protection for trees on public land. But you can see he had quite a property there. He actually called it Willow Lodge. So his niece and her husband, Ludwig and Mary Hansen, came to Canada in 1924 to look after Pete as he was getting older. And that's Greta Spearbrecher's parents. So Mary Hansen Place in Columbia Park is named after this Mary Hansen, Pete's niece. Pete was a little bit involved in local politics in the early days, but he was I think a bit of a character, didn't get along well with people, so he didn't have a great career on city council. But there's often see a lot of letters to the editor from him complaining about one thing or another. The Abrahamson family was one of the early Swedish families to come here in 1885. There were several brothers. There was Andrew, John, Charles, Noah, and later Otto, William, who all came out, and their father was here for a while as well. They came from Dorsland, Sweden. They were born there in the mid 1800s, and a lot of them, the family had come to Minnesota, where a lot of Swedish families had settled, and then from there they came into Canada and followed railway construction across. There were quite a few Swedish settlers who did that. They started running hotels, bakeries along the construction, as well as working in construction. And they established a hotel at Beavermouth, and then they decided that they would move on to Revelstoke and establish their hotel here. So the two brothers, John and Charles, packed up their tent hotel, and they had it packed across Rogers Pass on the unfinished railway grade. Packers wouldn't take their heavy billiard table, which was a good moneymaker for the hotel. And at the time, it was possibly the only billiard table between Calgary and Kamloops. So Andrew, with the other brother, left via the Columbia River, and he brought his belongings with him on a raft, which is probably just a scow with oars. I found an article about his trip by a man named Bill Lowe. Said that Andrew set off on May 1st, 1885. Said, when Andrew, running his scow into that twisting cleft that led to Death Rapids, felt it suddenly lurch down the steep pitch of water like Moberly 16 years before, he could do nothing but try to fend off the worst of the rocks and paddle his way out of the whirlpools. Somehow he made it through. He reached Farwell on May 8th, and the day before, a fire had gone through and burned down most of what was already in Farwell at that time. The Abrahamson brothers set up a canvas shelter 40 feet by 40 feet square on Front Street. By winter, they had built a wood framework around it faced with cedar shakes. And he actually, Andrew, when he came around on the scow, he was the one that he had the pool table. He's the one that transported the pool table. He also had a dog and cat with him on the trip, and they all managed to survive. So they made it to here, started their tent hotel initially, and then they eventually added to the hotel. By 1908, it was this large 3-story hotel that you see on the right on Front Street, approximately at, I think, from about King Street down from there. One of the other brothers, Carl Gustav, he married Ida Josephine Stone, originally named Stromdahl, and I'll talk about the Stones in just a little bit. They were another early Swedish family that came here. They had their honeymoon on the steamer Columbia on the trip down the river, and they built their house next to the hotel. That's the corner of their house that can be seen there. They had 4 children, Carl, Oscar, Albert, Douglas, and Ethel. And Carl was one of the Revelstoke casualties during the First World War. He was one of a few of the young men who were actually born in Revelstoke who died in the war. The Abrahamson family was also quite involved in Trout Lake, and they were instrumental in the formation of Trout Lake. In fact, some of the original street names were named after the brothers. They operated hotels in that area as well. John Abrahamson, who's shown here, was another of the brothers, was quite involved in the Queen's Hotel at Trout Lake, and served as an alderman on city council for 13 years. The hotel, as I say, it underwent a few different transformations. There were renovations in 1897, and at that time they were able to accommodate 100 guests. And then this picture shows their 1908 renovation. It was known as one of the best hotels in Revelstoke at the time and was frequent by commercial travelers. They always had a good dining room with a good chef. By 1918, the hotel had been taken over by the Molson's Bank. A lot of the hotels were victim to prohibition, which came into effect in 1917. And a lot of the hotels made their money on liquor sales, because that's actually where you would buy bottles of liquor as well as buying individual drinks. That was before there was any actual liquor stores. So when they could no longer sell liquor, they couldn't keep a viable business. So they went under, and it was by 1919 it was torn down by the contractor Anselmo Pratolini for lumber. The other brother who came here was Otto William Abrahamson, and rather than being involved in the hotel business, he came here in 1888 to join his brothers, and then he went into business as a contractor. And these are showing some of the buildings that he built during his career here. He built the Queen Victoria Hospital, which was torn down in the 1970s, where Save on Foods is now. He built what's now Style Trend, his Bourne Brothers grocery store. He built the high school in 1914. That's now the distillery and old school eatery. And he built the agricultural hall, which is now the golf club clubhouse. He was also the mayor of Revelstoke in 1923. And he still has family members living in town. Some of his daughters who married in town, they still have family here. Babs Defoe was one of his granddaughters, and so her daughter, who still lives in town, or a couple of daughters are related, and so are the Karen Olsen and her sisters are related as well. One of their sons, Alfred, died in a head-on collision in east of at Loretta, about 17 miles east of Revelstoke, on January 1929. He and Orville Thompson were the trainmen on their respective trains, and so they died as a result of that head-on collision. Alfred had actually been born in Trout Lake because their family had lived there for a while. Was born there in 1906. And their daughter Lily was a well-known local school teacher.
She taught me.
Did she?
Yep.
Wow.
I was wondering when you were going to mention her.
Yeah. No.
She was an old maid teacher. She never married.
Yeah. And so also wanted to talk about the Stone family. And the Stone was originally named Stromdahl. And like a lot of the immigrants, a lot of them changed their names to anglicize them. So the Stromdahls changed their last name to Stone. And they were also from Sweden. They were another one of the families that had immigrated to Minnesota and then crossed over into Canada and followed railway construction across. John Stone was traveling with his son, John Albert Stone, and John Albert was about 16 years old during railway construction. And in 1884, they had built a little log hotel at Holt City, which is at Lake Louise. And they were later running a little restaurant at Muir's Tunnel near Field. They had 2 tents, a kitchen and a dining room in one, and a sleeping accommodations in the other. Meals were 50 cents, and accommodation was 50 cents a night. And they did supply blankets, no beds, but blankets. They also had a little hotel and restaurant at First Crossing, which was Donald. And then at that time, John Stone Sr. had arranged to have a hotel built in Revelstoke, and he was continuing to run his business at Donald, and he had his 16-year-old son at the time, John Albert, walk to Revelstoke from Donald to oversee construction of the new hotel. And there was a letter that he wrote to, that John Albert Stone wrote to Earl Dickey in January of 1936, describing his trip. He said, I arrived at First Crossing, Donald, about September 1884, and remained there till the latter part of February 1885, at which time I started on foot for Second Crossing, Farwell, which I reached March 1st. As near as I remember, it took me 4 or 5 days. The first night I spent at Beaver, which was a pretty busy place at the time. And he was a little bit concerned about bears and cougars, but there was just rough work trails. The rail hadn't come through at that time, so there was not even a railway bed built. So that was a 16-year-old who walked from Donald to Revelstoke. The original hotel was constructed of logs. It was finished about the end of March that year, and that his father brought supplies from First Crossing by team about a couple of weeks after John Albert made it here. They originally called their hotel the Stockholm House, and it was 50 by 50 feet. And the upstairs was what was known in a lot of these Wild West hotels as a ram's pasture. So it was basically just a room with bedrolls. There were no walls in between. It was just very rough sleeping accommodations, so no women were staying at places like this. That's what they called it, a ram's pasture. So it was basically just put your bedroll down and that's where you're sleeping for the night. It was renovated and renamed the Oriental Hotel, which is the picture on the left, in May 1898. They said they named it after a famous hotel in San Francisco, the Oriental. They added a second story and increased the frontage to 50 feet with 20 rooms. And it said from the Kootenai Mail from May 14th, 1898 says, the new house is practically new from top to bottom. It's most comfortably furnished and fitted up, and with its popular management should have a larger patronage than ever. On the ground floor are the bar room, large dining room, office, and sitting room. The bar back in the bar room is a very handsome piece of work executed in Vancouver from a design by C.B. McLean, who was a local builder and architect. The dining room is a large, well-lighted and airy room, nicely furnished and papered, and the office and sitting room of considerable size and character. On the second floor, there are 17 large bedrooms, 11 in the new portion and 6 in that built last summer. They are all bright, cheery rooms and are well furnished. It said it was Mr. Stone's ambition to make it the best $1 house in town. In the fall of 1908, they extended the frontage to 87 feet and added a third story, increasing the guest rooms to 46. John Stone Sr. Died in April of 1896, and he's buried in Revelstoke Cemetery. If any of you have done the cemetery tour with me before, you'll know that there's an area where there's a few graves that are on an angle, and I've never been able to figure exactly why they're not oriented the same as all the other graves, but John Stone's was the first of those that were planted on that angle. So I'm not sure whether it was, they are kind of pointing north, so maybe it was, they wanted to be oriented to north, but I haven't been able to definitively figure out why his grave is that way. This hotel was on Front Street. Believe it was at the end of Benson Avenue on Front Street. It looks like it operated until 1918. I think it was probably another victim of prohibition. John Stone, this would have been John Albert Stone at the time, the son, was the proprietor at that time, and he was actually charged with selling liquor on the premises during prohibition. So it was, pretty serious charge. That was really the lifeblood of their operations, but with prohibition, it just made it too risky. So he actually was sentenced to 6 months at Kamloops. And it was it was torn down in 1919 at the same time that the Central. So those were two of the really big hotels on Front Street, and that's sort of another victim of the change of location of the town site too, from Front Street up to Mackenzie and First with the moving of the railway station up here. It created those two town sites, and Front Street clearly lost out as the business area. They were really two of the last businesses still existing on Front Street, the Central and the Oriental. This is Charles Frederick Lindemark, and he was born in Sweden in 1865 and immigrated first to Chicago, where he worked in the Pullman rail car factory, then came to Revelstoke in 1888. He was working with the CPR initially as a laborer, and began to learn English with the help of the local police constable, Jack Kirkup. And by June of 1890, he was partner in a firm with Robert Howson and Mrs. Banbury, and that started the Howson Furniture Company and also the Howson Funeral Parlor. He was involved with a lot of local businessmen in town. He became a partner with C.B. Hume, who had the big department store where the Royal Bank is now. He was also involved in when the company opened branch stores at Trout Lake, Ferguson, and Arrowhead, and he was in charge of the stores down there. Said at one time it took 9 4-horse teams to keep all of the branch stores supplied. He was very involved in the Methodist Church, and the summer of 1894, he was married to Amanda Anderson, who had come to Chicago from Sweden. They were married in Calgary, and he brought her here on the train. They arrived in Revelstoke in the middle of the night and went to their home and where they were living at that time on Campbell Avenue between First and Victoria. His friends had arranged something called a chivaree, which was kind of a drunken celebration of a wedding. So it was a chance for mostly the men, especially the remaining bachelors, to sort of make as much noise and as they possibly could, and it involved a fair bit of alcohol generally as well. And apparently the wife wasn't terribly impressed with this and was rather scared by the whole procedure. They in 1908, the family moved into the home on Mackenzie Avenue that's still there at 706 Mackenzie Avenue, and it became one of the local gathering places for events in town. They had a really very large lawn, and you can see it had the upper veranda as well, and they'd even have a band playing or a few instruments playing on the veranda when they were having events. During the First World War, they used that as a tee for a lot of the fundraising activities for that the women's clubs, Women's Canadian Club and the Red Cross Society were doing, and send-offs for some of the local nurses who were going off to the war. Lindemark was chairman of the school board and justice of peace, and he served as mayor in 1908 and 1909. And during his tenure as mayor, they built the first trail up Mount Revelstoke, and they named it the Lindemark Trail. Now, the interesting thing is that the Lindemark Trail that's there now is not the original Lindemark Trail. The original Lindemark Trail is what is now the trail, like the main trail, the Summit Trail. That was originally the Lindemark Trail, and we haven't figured out when they changed the names, but at some point they, I think they wanted the main trail to be known as the Summit Trail to be marked as sort of the, sort of the main trail up, and the sort of the back trail was renamed the Lindemark. But during the time that he was mayor, this was before Mount Revelstoke was a national park, but the council of the time approved funding for the local mountaineering club to build a first chalet at Balsam Lake. So he was very supportive of the development of Mount Revelstoke, and one of the local people who was involved in campaigning for it to become a national park. Lindemark also became very involved in the milling industries, and for a while was a partner in the Big Eddy sawmill and others along the Arrow Lakes. I've talked in other talks about some of the big forest companies. There was some shenanigans happening in the early teens, early 1912, 13, where there was companies that were formed, and they were trying to get investment from England, and they were misrepresenting the amount of timber limits that they had, and so the firm was overinvested, and it went into receivership. And Lindemark was one of the people who was appointed to sort of take over this failing this company and get it back on track. So he did manage to do that. So he was very involved in the sawmill industry, the logging industry in town, and he had a lot of mining interests as well. A lot of the local people most local entrepreneurs also had mining interests. It was a big industry here at the time. There was a Scandinavian Aid and Fellowship Society that was a branch of it was formed here in Revelstoke in October of 1908. There was a man named Charles Erickson of Rossland who was a member of the society, and he talked the local Scandinavian settlers into forming a society. This was a branch of a North American society that had its headquarters in Michigan, was founded in the 1880s by Scandinavian immigrants. At the first meeting, they had 22 charter members, and the charter executive was John Abrahamson, Gus Headstrom, H. Carlson, and C. Grantstrom, and J. A. Stone. And at the height of the organization, they had 158 members. So this is one of the pages from their register, and it has the list of the names. This is the first page, so it has the list of like the charter members there, and it says where they were, when year they were born, where they were born, and their occupation. So it's really good information. This is book that I've used quite a bit when we've had genealogists or family historians coming in looking for information on their Swedish or Norwegian family. So it's been quite helpful to do that. So we have the actual book in the archives. They eventually built a little hall at the corner of Rokeby and 2nd Street, but it was gone by 1925. And I think the organization folded by that time as well. I'm going to talk a little bit about Charles Holton, although he didn't want to admit that he was Swedish. I'm not sure why, but his original name was Carl Holtengren, and he was born October 20th, 1865 in Sweden. And then the family moved to Minnesota shortly after that. He was another person who followed railway construction here, and came into this area in 1885 and began placer mining on Lardo Creek near Trout Lake City with a few partners. They located the Silver Cup mine, which was the earliest rich strike in the Lardo, and it's still an operating mine now. In 1897, said they bonded 4 claims on the Great Northern for $82,000 and sold the Silver Cup for $25,000, making a total of $107,000. That is in 1897 funds. I haven't done the translation, but it's a lot of money. So he became quite rich as a result of his mining efforts. As I said, he didn't like to, he changed his name to Holton from Holtengren. And in the census records, he gives his citizenship as American and said that he was born in America. So I'm not sure why he didn't want to be Swedish. He also didn't want to be as old as he was, because every census record, he was a little younger, and even younger still when he died in 1918. For what we can tell, the actual age of his death from the records I got from the family, he was 53 when he died, but his obituary said that he was 49. So, and he did eventually become a Canadian citizen. When he came into settled back into Revelstoke, he was quite involved with several local businesses. And in 1897, he and a couple of partners built Enterprise Brewery. And that was, he eventually sold it, but that brewery was in operation until the 1950s. This is his home, which is still in existence. It operates as a bed and breakfast at the top of First Street Hill. And he was built in, they started construction in the end of 1897 when he married his wife, Eliza or Lida Edwards, also known as Lida Silcott. That's another story, but how she ended up with a different name as well. But it was, I've heard, I haven't been able to confirm this, but I've heard sort of local legend is that he brought a craftsman over from Sweden to do the trims, and it took a year to complete all of the trims and all of the work on the building. It really is a beautiful home. There's a picture of the Charles and Lida in the parlor of their home around 1900. It's hard to see in this photograph, but there's something on the floor that looks like a baby, but it's kind of weird. And the baby's on the floor and the dog's on the couch. We've always called that the ghost baby picture because we haven't quite been able to figure out exactly what's going on. But you can see it's an absolutely beautiful home. The decorating style at that era was everything you could cram into the place and as many different patterns as you could possibly incorporate. So it's real competing patterns in a lot of these places. But that was the style of the day. When their house was built, it was built with a ballroom on the 3rd floor. And so there were a lot of local entertainments and benefits for the St. Peter's Anglican Church and for the Red Cross Society, and the Women's Canadian Club were held there as well. So even though he didn't want to be a Swede, he was, and so I included him in my talk. The Enterprise Brewery, which operated until the 1950s. That is on Charles Street, where the Alpine Motel is now, between 2nd and 3rd Streets. So talk about the Turnroth family, which was another of the early families that was here by 1885, also following railway construction. So Klaus, who's the third on the right in that upper photograph, was born in Sweden in 1853. He attended college and then came to Canada. He married Emma Christina Johansson, who is pictured there, in 1878. And their first child, Selma, was born in 1879. So they came to Canada and had children along the way, and children once they settled here as well. Klaus had to, when he applied to immigrate to Canada, he was told that he had to do 3 years in the Swedish Army before he could immigrate. So he did that and was actually hired by the CPR while he was still in Sweden, and took a 3-month course in English before he left the country. They arrived in Winnipeg in 1880, and he immediately went to work for the CPR as a quartermaster. And his wife and daughter, Selma, joined him in the fall of 1881. They traveled by a steamship to New York and then by train to Winnipeg. Their son, Charles, was born in Winnipeg in 1882. And then the family moved across with railway construction and lived for almost a year at Ross Peak. The family story is said that Selma, at the age of 5, scalded her foot on boiling water and had to remain in bed for quite a while. So her mother taught her how to knit. And before long, she was knitting socks to sell to the railway workers. In 1885, the family established a homestead at Greeley, 7 miles east of Revelstoke, where Klaus had acquired 120 acres of farm and timberland. In 1886, he built a home on the hill across the tracks from the site of the Save on Foods, so just across the tracks in that area. And they eventually built a livery stable there, and all of the family, especially Charles and Frank, were involved in running the livery service. So they were the local taxi service in Revelstoke. The 3 of the Turnroth family died as young adults during the flu pandemic. Hilda at the time had been married, and she was living in Vancouver, and she died in 1918 during the flu pandemic. And then another brother, Harry, who was married with a young family, and brother Gus, all died. Frank, who's the man standing there, was also very ill, but he survived. So that was, there were over 30 people from Revelstoke who died during the flu pandemic. This family was particularly hard hit, with 3 family members dying. So the Klaus Turnroth, he operated, this is showing their livery and stables and their house across the tracks. And Charles Turnroth, who was a driver as well. So the father, Klaus, operated the first horse-drawn taxi service. And he also drove pack trains of horses into the Big Bend, assisted by his sons. His wife, Emma, owned a building where the Taco Club is now, and it was later moved across the street, and I believe it's the building that now houses the Pulse Boot Shop. She ran a confectionery and fruit store in the original location, and she also sold plants and fancy work, knitting and embroidery, and also hats made by her daughter Hilda, who was a milliner or hat maker. So they were quite an entrepreneurial family. We believe that Emma Turnroth may have been the first female business owner in town, but I haven't been able to confirm that. Klaus died in a fire at Greeley in 1910 at the age of 57, and Emma died in 1915, also at the age of 57. The oldest daughter, Selma, married Reg Upper, and they had several children, and they had this farm and this beautiful farmhouse on what's now the Columbia Park Road, the road on the way to the golf course. Upper Place, that's there near the golf course, is not upper as in upper and lower, it's upper as in the Upper family. They had a strawberry farm there, and some cows and their farmhouse. Some of their grandchildren, great grandchildren, are still alive and still in Revelstoke. The Headstrom family, and I think other family members from the Uppers. Mr. Upper, who is not Swedish, but he was a police constable in town for a while, and he died in quite a tragic accident in 1919 when most of his children were still quite young. He'd been on a hunting trip with his friend Guy Barber, and they stopped on Mackenzie Avenue to let Guy Barber out in front of his jewelry store, which is now the paddleboard store. And they had a couple of hunting dogs in the car, along with a loaded rifle. And one of the dogs hit the trigger of one of the rifles, and it discharged into Mr. Upper's chest. And he was taken to a hospital, but didn't survive. So it's quite a tragedy for the family. And this beautiful house burned down sometime in the 1930s. So another local character, this is Andrew Rupert Westerberg. He was born in Sweden in May of 1879, came to the late Canada in the late 1890s and settled first at Wetaskiwin in Alberta. In 1900, he was on the train heading to Vancouver when he got talking to a couple of people who were getting off at Revelstoke and planning to go mining in the Big Bend. And he rather liked that idea, so he got off with them and never left. So he ended up with the contract for the mail delivery into the Big Bend, starting in 1914. He had to do 15 trips a year at $45 a trip. He had to do 2 trips a month in the 3 summer months, and 1 trip a month for the rest of the year. He was traveling from Revelstoke to French Creek, which was a distance of 70 miles. He had a weight limit of 100 pounds in the summer when he could use a pack horse, and 50 pounds in winter when he traveled by either snowshoe or skis. And we have some of his skis and his snowshoes and one of his pack saddles in our collection in the museum. He was, the round trip would take him 6 to 7 days. At that time, there were up to 1,500 people living in the Big Bend at the beginning of his contract. He delivered the mail up the Big Bend for 35 years until he was 70 years old. He married Annie Kate Olsen from Norway in 1910, and they built a homestead south of Revelstoke, which is where Westerberg Road is now. They had 7 children. He ended up with the nickname Oli the Bear. Oli was kind of a general term for people from Sweden, and the bear was tacked on because of some of his many encounters with bears. One story is that he was on the trail doing his mail route, bent over with the weight of his pack, and with obscured vision, he rounded a bend and came face to face with a grizzly. He tried to run, but the bear closed in on him and slashed at his clothing. They were on a steep slope, and together the bear and Oli slipped and rolled in the slush and snow. Oli managed to get to his feet, staying away from the bear's claws. He recovered his rifle, which had fallen during the scuffle, down the hill and fired at the charging bear. The shot seemed to have no effect, and it clawed at him. Oli ducked, but slipped, and the bear was on top of him. He could feel the warm blood flowing from the animal, and it died right on top of him. He eventually struggled out from under the bear, shouldered his pack, and continued on his mail run. There's another story where he killed a bear with an axe, as he didn't have his rifle with him and came upon one in his trap line, and managed to, doing a little bit of a dance, killed it with his axe. So that's some of the ways he earned the name Oli the Bear. There was also a story about when he was had gone up into the Big Bend and came across a horse that was abandoned because the snow had come in and they couldn't get the horse out and they couldn't get enough feed in for it. So they were going to shoot it. And Oli said, if I give you $1 for the horse, can I have it? And they said yes, not expecting him to be able to do anything other than shoot it. But he spent a day trying to fashion different kinds of snowshoes. And they finally came up with a design that worked. And he walked the horse into town and tied it up at the post of one of the hotels and went in for a drink and casually told about this horse that was tied up outside. And so that was made quite a sensation. I have seen other pictures and stories of horse snowshoes, so it could be done, but Ole managed to get himself a practically free horse out of that adventure. Gus Headstrom was another local miner. Don't have too much information on him, but he came here in the 1890s from Sweden and spent most of his career as a miner and timber development. And at one time, he owned several mining properties in the Albert Canyon area as well. A lot of the miners also had trap lines, and it was actually often more, you could actually make more money on a trap line sometimes than you could on a mining claim. So we have some of the trappers records, the fur records from the F.B. Wells, who had the fur press that we have on display, and it shows you the extent of work that these men were able to do, and some of the good money that they could make on their trap lines. The Lundell family was in an early family in Revelstoke. They came here, Axel Fred Lundell came here in 1892, and he worked on railway construction, and he also planned to go to the coast, but ended up staying here. Did a lot of mining in the Big Bend, and they was involved in some of the early sawmills in town. He had a contract for the erection of the first pole line from the first local hydro plant on the Ilsilot River. And he also did a lot of the work opening up the Mackenzie Avenue and clearing that street for the buildings that went up there. Carried out a number of contracts at the city hydro plant as well. He was offered the position as supervisor of the public works department, and he continued in that position for 25 years, never missing a day of work. He retired at 1935 at the age of 69. And after he was retired, he was often called in to locate a valve or a line because he knew where they all were. He purchased 3.5 acres of land where Centennial Ballpark is now, and had a little farm property there, as well as their home at 4th and Robson. His wife was Kirsten Cederholm, and she was born in Sweden and was a graduate of Lund University and taught school there before coming to BC. And she was also a published poet. They had several children, among them Arvid Lundell, who was mayor of Revelstoke, MLA, the editor of the Revelstoke Review for many, many, many years. And his sister Dorothea Lundell, who's also a really well-known school teacher in town, really beloved teacher. I'm going to talk a bit now about the contribution of the Scandinavian settlers to our ski culture here. The man on the right is Ole Sandberg, and he's the one that's credited with starting the skiing in Revelstoke, really introducing people to skiing. He was spotted in town in 1890 where he had skied in from his mines at Albert Canyon into town. And that was the first mention of skiing that I've seen in the local newspapers. And they referred to his skis as Norwegian snowshoes at the time. So after that, sort of local clubs sprung up, and there was quite a few people involved in skiing locally at that time. But the first clubs were recreational clubs. And in 1914, a competitive ski club formed with 23 members. That was before then, we often talk about the ski club starting in 1891, and there certainly were ski clubs that early, but the competitive club started in 1914. And that was really because by that time there were many Norwegian and Swedish settlers here. A lot of them had settled in the Big Eddy. That was the biggest concentration of Scandinavian people in the area, was the Big Eddy. Quite a few of them had farms there. A lot of them worked in the forest industry. in the mills and in the woods logging. And so out of that sort of culture, especially then from the Norwegian settlers, their sport was ski jumping, and they wanted to introduce it here. They wanted to have competitions. So they started the club in the fall of 1914. And in 1915, February 6th, they had their first winter carnival. And they got all into it. They had somebody build this 40-foot tall snowman that they unveiled as part of the ceremony. They were long speeches by the mayor and other people at the time. They had the first ski jump competition in town. This first year, it was on the base of Mount Revelstoke on a small hill. And then by 1916, the next year, they were able to get permission from Parks Canada and from the new Mount Revelstoke National Park to build the jump inside the park boundaries. And that's basically the jump that's still there now as part of the interpretation in Mount Revelstoke National Park. It's no longer an active jump, but the site is still there. And there's some really lovely interpretation about that site that became real big part of Revelstoke's history for up until the 1970s. The first president of the ski club was Sigurd Halvorsen, and his family, he had a brother and sister living here, and his father, and he and his wife Selma were living here, and he was the first president of the club, and for the first 3 years. And they moved to Vancouver, and he died there in 1919. This is the second winter carnival in 1916, and Sigurd Halvorsen is at the right holding the flag. Nels Nelson is 1A, and I'll be talking about him shortly as well. The Gunnerson family was also really important in the ski culture in Revelstoke. Jorgen Michael Gunnerson and his wife Anna Catherine Gunnerson were both born in Norway in 1882. Jorgen came to Revelstoke with Eliseus Nelson and his son Nels early in 1913. And then Anna and their sons Carl Hans and Gunnar arrived in July of 1913, and they took up residence in Big Eddy. A fourth son, Emil, was born in Revelstoke. Anna and Jorgen were active in the group that organized the first ski club. Jorgen won the cross-country event 3 years in a row and retired the trophy. He made skis under the trademark Blue Nose, and we have some of his skis in our collection. He was one of the real noted ski makers in town. Anna was a well-known ski racer who competed in Banff, Calgary, and various places in BC from 1915 to the 1930s. She was still racing at the age of 48. She once started behind the 17-year-old boys and still crossed the finish line first. She often gave other women racers a head start of about 100 yards and still won most of the races. She died in 1956 at the age of 73, and Jorgen died at 1977 at the age of 94. All four sons were excellent skiers. Carl was a good skier in all disciplines. During World War II, he was an instructor training soldiers in the use of skis. He was wounded in action and returned home. Gunnar was also a good skier and jumper. In 1923, he jumped 72 feet at the age of 7. Emil was also a good skier. He joined the Royal Canadian Air Force as a gunner and moved to Vancouver Island after the war. The second son, Hans, was expected to rival Nels Nelson. He had exceptional ability and near perfect form. His favorite event was jumping, but he also won in cross-country, slalom, downhill, and combined. In 1932, Bob Lindburn took the World Championship in Revelstoke with a jump of 287 feet, and Hans was runner-up with a jump of 281 feet. That was his career best. But Hans moved to Kimberley and set a hill record there. And then he signed up as a gunner with the Canadian Army and was killed in action in Holland in November of 1944. So the Nielsen family, they were related to a lot of the other families in town. Lysius Nielsen was born in 1864 in Norway, and he married Ida Louise Johansson, who was born in Sweden in 1872. And their family, her family she'd moved with her parents to Norway, where her father was looking for work, and ended up meeting and marrying Eliasius Nielsen. The name was originally spelled Nilsen, and they changed it to Nelsen when they came to Canada. It's often misspelled Nelson, but the Canadian spelling, the spelling that Nels used, was Nelsen. They had 6 children: Nils, Rebecca, Elise, Nana, Ivan, and Henrietta. And when they, Eliasius and Nils came in the 1913 and bought a piece of land in Big Eddy and built a 2-story house with a big fireplace. There's their farmyard with Elise and Nels. I've got too much information here. So of course, Nels became the world champion skier and was really Revelstoke ski hero, but the whole family skied. His sisters always competed in ski races, as well as Henrietta, Nana, and Elise Nelson, and Anna Gunnerson, about 1920. The younger brother, Ivan, was also a noted skier. He was a boys champion in most of, when as a youngster, getting some really amazing jumps as a young boy. And he ended up working in Frontenac, Quebec, as a ski instructor. So that second picture shows him in Quebec. Ivan was noted for his near perfect form. Said he was just very graceful, like a bird soaring through the air. And there's a women's ski race on Mackenzie Avenue. Number 1 is Mrs. Gunnerson, and the 2 others are Nelsons, but I can't remember which is which, but they're 2 of the Nelson sisters. And the 3 is upside down. Yeah, so there's Nels. I made an error on the typing there. Nels Nelson, of course. And he was he won the competition the first year in 1915. And in 1916, he won the competition and became the Canadian champion. And before long, he was the world's champion. He in the 1920s, he had a jump of 240 feet, and he held that record for many years. So he was really Revelstoke's ski hero. Everybody kind of looked up to him. He was the person who put Revelstoke on the map in terms of skiing. So there's still members of the Nelsen family living in town, especially from the sisters who married here. One sister married Alf Burridge. Another sister married Frank Turnroth. So there's still members of that family that are part of the local community. There's Nels Nelson's world record jump of 240 feet, and one with Ivan, when you can see that beautiful form that he had. So this is just a very brief look into the Scandinavian community. There's many, many, many more families, and I couldn't deal with them all here today. But it's they certainly made a big contribution to the community, and it's fun to dive into the family stories and share some of this with you. So our next talk is November 23rd, and it's a special presentation by Rosemary Tracy, who's spent decades diving into the Italian history. This next talk, she's going to be focusing on the history of Woodenhead, which was carved by her uncle, Peter Fiocco, and on the Fiocco family and some of the other early Italian families. So thank you for coming today. And I'll just thank you for listening.